so excited to talk about your book. I loved every second of it. It was such a fun read, especially coming from I'm a huge fan of the New York 2000s rock scene. The title of the book is "The World Is Going to Love This: Up from the Basement with the Strokes." So tell me a little bit about where that title came from. What kind of inspired it? It's kind of a mouthful.
Well, when I wrote the book, I had a really crappy working title. Like it was gonna like My Life with the Strokes or 8 Years with the Strokes. I knew I didn't have a real title, but I had a working title. And when I got my publisher, Lucy at Wordville, I told her, I don't know what to call the book, really. I've thought for 2 years and I can't come up with a name I like. She said, don't worry, I'm very good at coming up with titles of books. And about a week later, she said, okay, in your book, when you're talking about how you met Regina Spektor, you say, when you heard her music in 1 minute, you said, oh, the world is going to love this. I have to work with her. So she said, the world is going to love this is the perfect title for your book. And I said, yep, that is so cool. Thank you very much.
It definitely works out perfectly, especially with the range of artists that you've worked for that have been successful in their music. It's an incredible, I love the title. It fits everything very perfectly. So you said somewhere about 2 years is it took you to write this book?
It actually took me about 3 months to write the book.
Okay.
Then it took me about a year to edit it 3 times by myself because what I thought was the perfect book when I wrote it, when I read it, there were like 1,000 commas that didn't need to be there and sentences that lasted half a page that I had to chop into real sentences. So I would say it took really about a year and a month or something to get the book to where I liked it.
Well, that's quite the process.
Mhm.
So what was it like when you were writing down all these memories? Did you have to, was there anything that you turned to? Like, was there picture archives or just kind of going racking your brain through all these memories?
Most of the book came from, like, I remember very well what happened and what was said and, like, the actual content in the book is very much from my memory, and it's very clear, like a movie I can see very clearly. But I used setlist.io. That's a website that shows you every band and their tours, where they played, when they played, and what was on their set list. I was going like, what happened first? Did I do this or did I see them there? And I go on set list and it says that was May, 2001 that they played in Boston. So that's when I did their sound. So I used that. I used some things on the internet as references to make sure my timeline and my memory were correct.
Well, that's a very helpful resource. I think I know the website you're talking about because I'm pretty sure I've used that before with other artists. But so did you have the idea for the book a long time ago or did you just start writing it?
It kind of evolved from the fact that for 20 years, I go in the studio all over the world working with young musicians. And invariably, when there's a break, we're eating lunch and one guy says, what was Julian Casablancas like? Or how did you get that sound? Or what microphone? There were like stories that I've told so many times to different people that in the back of my mind, I thought, I got to write these down. Like people want to know this stuff that I should just make a collection of the stories that people ask me questions about. So there was always this idea because of repeating the stories over and over to groups in Brazil, Argentina. They all want to know the same thing. And so I thought I should just write it down if everybody wants to know, and I'll do that. But as I said in the book, I didn't think I'd really write the book because I don't like to sit down. I don't like to sit down and type in a lonely room by myself. I'd rather walk to a coffee shop and look at the people in the street than
Yeah.
sit down by myself. So it was only because of lockdown I couldn't go anywhere. Well, what am I going to do with my time? Why don't you get that book out of your head and put it on the computer?
That made it the perfect 2 years to write a book.
Right,
A lot of different books and movies and all of that, all these ideas and music came out of that time, which is so incredible.
right.
So you kind of started off in the book with the beginning, like when you were in Seattle. So how did music first become a part of your life? Was it like a family influence or was it something that you kind of discovered on your own?
There was a family influence. My dad was a jazz saxophone player, but I didn't like his music. Like, it kinda bothered me. Even from when I was a little kid, he'd practice his saxophone to big band records while I was trying to sleep. So it was always like a little bit of a annoyance. But Then when I was 10 years old, he brought home the Beatles' Sergeant Pepper's album and put it on our family turntable. And when I heard that, even at 10 years old, I said like, "Whoa, that's awesome." Like there's something about it clicked. Like music is important and can be very cool. And then I heard more and more things that made me want to be a musician. And I took piano lessons when I was 8. And so I always had this like kind of musical thing in my childhood. And by the time I was 13, I was playing in bands around Seattle. And so that's how it really started.
Did you start off on any one instrument besides
Yeah,
the piano? I know you
piano
mentioned
piano and organ,
piano
which is like
organ.
an electric portable version of the piano at the time. Yeah.
Very nice. So, when your life began in Seattle, did you ever picture yourself moving to New York and beyond to pursue producing, or did it also just kind of happen organically?
In my childhood and teenage years when I was really in bands and learning to play and doing shows, I didn't really think of that. I just thought about like kind of becoming the most popular person in my city. And at one point I had a chance to join the most popular band in our city and I achieved that. Like when I
Mhm.
was about 18, I joined the most popular band and I had that experience. But later in my 20s, I started hearing all this music coming from London, like in the 80s, and New York, all these Patti Smith and Television and the Ramones. And it seemed to me that there were really cool scenes in New York and London. And also there were no record labels in Seattle. So nobody was really touring or getting deals or becoming kind of professional in a different way. And so I dreamt early from my early 20s on, I dreamt about I got to go to New York or I got to go to London because that's where it's really a serious business making music. That's where it happens. So yeah, it was always my intention to go to New York or London because I thought that's the center of music. There was also LA as a center of music, but I always thought LA was like silly. Like I thought I love Frank Zappa and I love The Doors, and that was LA. But all the
Mhm.
rest of it just seemed kind of like sunny and happy. And who wants to hear that? I want to hear like the weird depressive music of New
Yeah.
York, the angst and the tension. So I was never really I never really considered LA as somewhere I wanted to be for music. It was always New York or London.
So, how would during the time that you went to New York, how would you describe that time in music to someone who like didn't experience it at all?
Well, there were 3 times I went to New York. One was in the year 1984. A lot of my Seattle music friends had moved there and were, like, kinda living 5 at a time in these little rooms, but they were going out and they were part of the scene, and they invited me to come there, and I went for, like, a week. And in 1984, New York City, especially the East Village, was like a mecca. There were freaks and weirdos from all over the world in the streets, and you could tell who your tribe was by the clothing they wore. Like, oh, that's the kind of like the goth music and the Bat Cave music. Oh, that's the punk kind. Oh, that's the weird, gay, super weird performance art, drag queen stuff. Like you could see the different tribes by their clothing, which was awesome. And all together, it made like you're living in a circus. You just walk down the street from noon until 3 or 4 in the morning, and it was a constant parade of these people that were it was like a tribe. It was like incredible, really beautiful. But I didn't live there and I wasn't really participating in that. And then 5 years later in 1989, I had a chance to move there. And I thought, oh, wow, when they hear my music, they're going to think that this West Coast sound I've made is so weird and cool that I'm going to be very successful. And I didn't get successful. I made a few film soundtracks and I made a few experimental pieces at home, but basically, I had a terrible, terrible time and I had to go back to Seattle. And luckily I got back to Seattle in time for the grunge movement, and so I had some good times in Seattle that time.
Mhm.
Okay, so keeping on the New York theme, I had a chance to move there again at the end of the 90s, and it was really festive and it was really enjoyable, but it wasn't anything like it had been in the 80s. It wasn't like this massive explosion of music and youth, and it was already expensive to live there.
Mhm.
So the only people living in Manhattan were like trust fund kids or people whose parents sent them to NYU. and all the creative artists had to move far, far away out of Manhattan into far boroughs because it was just too expensive. So already the scene had changed by the time I moved there. And besides, the music was like acid jazz and DJs and backwards baseball hats and big jewel, the gold chains. And that's what you heard. You didn't see rock and roll bands and strange performance art walking around or every night in the East Village. It had really changed by the end of the 90s when I moved there.
So had the rock scene itself in New York died down a little bit previous to that?
Well, the grunge scene from Seattle had dominated the world of rock and roll really from like 1989 till about 1996. And so between 1996 and the year 2000, it was kind of like, okay, rock and roll's over. That thing was like really popular. We loved it, but it's old fashioned.
Mhm.
And, what's coming in now is pop music, dance music, jungle, drum and bass. All these things were now the new focus of culture. That's what was really being talked about. And that's what people were producing and what labels were signing. Yeah.
So were you still in Seattle or were you in New York when 9/11 happened?
I was in New York. That
So
was
tell me a little bit about that because I'd love to hear some firsthand experience from
well,
actually being in the city.
we recorded Is This It in 2001.
Hmm.
Okay, in like May and June. No, no, April, May of 2001, basically. And so that summer, the Strokes went out and they played all these festivals in England. And while they were doing that, I was vacationing in Europe and visiting friends and occasionally seeing Strokes shows over there. And then we came back at the end of summer, and that's when 9/11 happened, like about 3 weeks after I came back from my summer vacation, 9/11 happened. And I was like going to have a coffee at a bagel shop. And I look on the TV and there's a picture of a plume of smoke coming out of one of the trade centers. And there was a report about a possible plane having hit it. And I thought it was a seaplane because there's a seaplane business port for businessmen to fly in that part of Manhattan. So I thought maybe a plane got too close and, a little accident. But then as I was watching the TV, I could see a jet flying in the second one hit and I could hear it like out the door of the cafe. I could actually hear the explosion echoing up from Manhattan because I was only about maybe a mile and a half away from the actual impact. And then, whoa, this is really weird. And I quickly finished my bagel. I went out to the street and there were people coming up from the south of New York covered in ashes and like marching up, like it was like a parade of people like escaping. And very strange, very strange.
Yeah, I can imagine this everything that you wrote in the book and obviously seeing videos and stuff. I just couldn't
Yeah.
imagine
It was
physically being in
so
New York when
weird.
that happened.
The phone lines all went down, so you felt like cut off from talking to your family or anybody, and you didn't know if there was about to be another aerial, like if suddenly planes are going to start bombing. You didn't know what. You couldn't leave. They cut the bridge. You couldn't leave. It felt really weird that first moment, that first day or two. It was weird for weeks afterwards, but the first day or two were really kind of like being in a war zone.
Hmm. And 9/11 affected Is This It because they decided to take off New York City cops for
Right.
the
Right.
US release.
Yeah.
Were you a part of that decision or was that just kind of Ryan and the Strokes?
Well, the meeting where that decision was made took place in my studio. The last thing I ever imagined was that after we'd finished Is This It, that there would be now a new talk about making a new song for the album.
Hmm.
So basically, everyone met at my studio a week after 9/11 in my studio basement. It was the record label, the management, and the band. And they were just having a very open and honest discussion. There was no pressure. It was just like, what are we going to do? The New York police are being hailed around the country as being these heroes. So won't it kill us if we put out a record that says "Ain't Too Smart" right now? And they'd already released the music in Australia and UK and parts of Europe. So that intact record was already out in the world. It was only America that, what are we going to do? Because we were waiting for this big release in America, and now we're thinking we should probably take that song off and we need to record a new song. And so among themselves, I wasn't making my opinion. I don't really have an opinion. It's between them. It's their music and their label and management. But I was there at the meeting and they just decided, yeah, we'll take it off and we'll come back to the studio and quickly record a new song to stick on the album.
Yeah, so that was a huge deal and it affected everyone in all over the country, but kind of
Yeah,
transitioning away from the 9/11 scene and more just in New York in general. Tell me about the different studios that you worked at, because I know there was a couple in New York. There
right.
was Transport to I'm so scared I'm gonna pronounce it wrong.
Okay, it's German. You're not expected to say Transporterraum.
Transportarum. Okay.
Transporterraum. And before that, that was my second studio in New York. And before that, I worked with a guy who built a studio called Chateau Relaxo.
So relaxo,
And it
yes.
was at Chateau Relaxo, which was like a year before Transportaround, that I actually learned how to use computers to record music. The guy's named Scott Clark, and he built this beautiful studio in near Chinatown in New York called the Chateau Relaxo. And he basically taught me how to, yeah, here's how you open the computer. And he had really great microphones that I'd never used before. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot of major skills at his studio.
So that was kind of your first experience with using computers to produce.
Right. Before that, I'd use tape recorders or digital tape recorders, but I always hated I was very snobby against computers. I said, "What? You're fucking kidding me. You're gonna watch TV while you make music. You idiot. You know, why would you want to do that?" That was my philosophy. But
Mhm.
then once I started using computers to make music, I'm going like, wow, you can do so many layers and you have so much control and it's so great sounding that I changed my tune uh, in the year 1998 working at Chateau Relaxo.
Well, that must have been awesome just being in the scene with the computers and being able to use that
Right.
for the first time and having someone to teach you how to use that. And that
It was
became that's how you produced from there, correct?
right. That I mean, at that time, it was really a cutting edge technology. Like studios were just on the kind of the cusp of moving from tape recorders to computers. And so Chateau Relaxo was very interesting because it wasn't a multi-million dollar studio, a big commercial facility, but we had a little bit of equipment from every great brand that would be in major studios. So it was like, in a way, it was a model of studios that would come later. It was a very early model, and it wasn't my credit that I didn't think of that. My friend Scott Clark is a bit of a genius and he saw the future and he made an example of what a future studio looked like very early. And even Transportaround, because I had copied his idea with his blessing and I used many of the same pieces of equipment that he showed me were important, that became like what my friend Chad said. Called it a giant killer. It means that my little studio was going to, like, even though it was small and not multi-million dollars, but the way it was put together was going to deal a blow to the established larger studios that were already having trouble because those big old equipments, they cost a lot of money to maintain and rents were going up and it became harder and harder to be one of those big studios, which is why they all started closing down while studios like mine started popping up like mushrooms all over the world.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, was is there a specific genre of music that you enjoyed producing most, like still to this day, or like at during New York?
Yeah, still to this day, I would say I wouldn't say a stylistic genre as much as I would say when people go in a room and play instruments together with their hands, you know, and they look at each other and they make noise and all together in a room, that's kind of my specialty. I don't, even though I love it, I don't know how to use FL Studio and do trap beats and use those programs in there. I watch YouTube videos all the time about how those producers work, and I find it completely fascinating and so cool, but it's not my thing, you know? And so, like, when I was living in Berlin for 15 years, I hardly ever worked there because all they want to do is techno. And so they use different Ableton and they use different programs. They don't play in a room with a drummer and a guitar player and a keyboard player and a singer, which is where I know how to work.
Mhm.
So luckily, all over the world, people are still interested in this hand played, live, energetic human music. And so I'm still working.
And so a lot of your earlier music days were with some of your own bands, correct? Like
Oh,
Absinthe
yes.
and Sky
Yes.
Cries Mary. So
Uh-huh.
how did those bands like affect the musical trajectory of your life?
Well, once I learned how to play to my own, like, I think I was about 19 years old, where I had a breakthrough moment. All my years up to 19, when I played my music, I was like a little bit embarrassed and a little bit ashamed. I felt like I'm not very good. I can't really do it. You know, I just felt really bad about my own musicianship. Even though I was in many bands and having a good time, I knew that I wasn't where I wanted to be. And somewhere around 19, I learned I could play well, I could, make really cool sounds, and I could write songs. I started writing songs. And so the rest of my life was gonna be spent for 2 decades, I just recorded my own music. I just made songs day after day after day after day. And I had my own bands like Color Twigs, Mental Mannequin, Absinthe, and even in Sky Cries Mary, I wrote my own parts and things. So learning how to record and writing my own songs and making sounds became the skill set that I used when I met a band that said, "Hey, we want to record a song." Well, I used the same creativity and strategy that I did on my own music to help them get interesting sounds and to have a good time in the studio. Because I'd already spent like 20 years working on music in with recordings, and I kind of knew what makes you feel happy and what takes your makes your energy go up and your performance go up rather than what might tear you down or be critical or uncomfortable and make you play worse than you know you can, if
Mhm.
that makes sense.
So this question can be like from your own personal band experience or from any other bands, but what is there a specific project that you are most proud to have worked on?
Well, there are many, many, many projects. It can't be just one. You know, in my book, I talk a lot about my favorite ones, like the Satellites from Mallorca, Strokes, Regina Spektor, working with Anne and Absinthe, my own band, Color Twigs. And there's lots of projects. I worked on this band last summer, in summer 2021, in Seattle called Cab Ellis, and they're in New York right now. And making their album was one of the pinnacle experiences. It's so beautiful. So there's a list, and those are some of them.
Excellent. Yeah, I had so much fun reading about all of these different experiences with these bands and how a lot of them were very different from each other, but you were still able to work with them all the same, and such a beautiful
Right.
thing. So, what
Thanks.
other bands and artists have influenced your particular style of production?
Well, many artists that with working together with their producer or whatever came up with like kind of cutting edge new sounds at the time, like Jimi Hendrix.
Mhm.
So to this day, nobody can do what he did sonically or guitar wise or his voice and his words. Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Janis Joplin, Pearl Jam's first album, Alice in Chains' first couple albums, what else? Bauhaus, Susie and the Banshees, Cocteau Twins, Thomas Dolby, The Smiths, The Cure, like those bands. Skinny Puppy, this band from Vancouver. Those are some bands that really changed my course, opened my mind, and gave me great inspiration for where creativity can happen in music.
Yeah, that's an amazing lineup of bands to have inspired your work a lot. So, when you're in the studio with an artist, are you more accustomed to like taking their feedback and putting it into a song, or like pushing out your own musical ideas to improve the track, or both?
Good question. The answer is that basically, from the moment a band contacts me, and once I understand that we'll probably work together and we're organizing it, I'm basically doing everything I can to let them have a chance to show their idea, to listen to their own ideas, and then critique it themselves, and then step in maybe if there's a question or if I hear something possible to do better, I might suggest it, but everything I do as a producer is based on making sure that the people who are making the music are very happy with the way it comes out, and I'd say 98% from their own ideas and their own playing and their own sounds, like, let them have a chance to do it, and if they have a question, I'm happy to step in and turn a knob on their amp or make a suggestion, but a lot of what I do is just making sure that they feel listened to and respected and given a chance to hear their music the way they want. So it's very much driven by the artist.
So if you have a moment where an artist isn't satisfied with what they're doing and they just don't like how it sounds, is there something that you typically try or you use to
Yes.
try to help them
Yes.
improve it, like one method?
I'm always watching not only the needles on the machines in my control room, but I'm watching the faces of the musicians to see the smile level and the happiness level, and I'm happy to report that most of the time in the studios, the musicians are having such a great time and they're like slapping themselves on the back and they're like really energetic and enthusiastically listening back and doing their work. But sometimes it happens that they're having some trouble or they're dissatisfied with either something they might have recorded yesterday, they wanna redo it, or something they can't quite get a solo the way they want, and then I'm happy to step in with suggestions like, "Oh, you're having trouble with your solo? Just play whatever you want, now do it again 3 or 4 times." I go, "Okay, stop, and then give me a minute," and I cut the best bits of the 4 different parts, and I get rid of everything that sounds not exciting, and I kinda manufacture a solo for them out of pieces of their own solos, and then they listen to it and they go like, "Yeah, I did that. That's so cool. How do you that sounds great." Or, in a way, there's 2 types of people that are dissatisfied. There's a type of person that is dissatisfied, and with work and suggestions and effort, they become satisfied, and there are some kind of people that love dissatisfaction, and no matter what you do, they're still gonna be dissatisfied because that's their psychological MO, and those kind of people are very hard to deal with in a creative and producer situation. I've met some people like that.
Yeah, that's an awesome process. Just the way that you are able to work with artists and give them feedback while also taking in what they're giving to you and what they want to come out with at the end.
Yeah.
So, how would you describe the process of working with the Strokes versus working with other artists? Was there like one thing that was different or that kind of led you to believe things
There's
got
a lot different, a lot different. The one of the main things that was different is the level of kind of individual and collective perfection that they wanted, like, they were never gonna let any slight thing, sound, level of volume, performance, they were never gonna get one little thing go onto the finished product and say, "Ah, it's okay." They never said, "Ah, that's okay," or "It's good enough." It was never like that, it was like, it's either perfectly right or needs to be done again, which meant that they worked a little bit harder than any other group I've ever worked with, except for Regina Spektor, to really, really make sure every little element was as good as it possibly could be. So I think that's one of the that's one, and also, um, I think that the complexity of what they did, each individual part was very scripted and very specific. Like Albert played a melody, Nick played a different melody and Nikolai played a different melody and Julian sang a different melody and all those things were scripted and prepared and it had to be a certain way. It wasn't just like a few chords and you just play it over and over again. You kind of just like get lost in the feeling of it. It was actually really specific and meticulous in the composition that's different than most bands that I record. I'll stop there.
Well, yeah, it's I feel like even just listening to their music versus other artists, there's something so special about it. There's something much different in Is This It versus like other albums and stuff. Was there something that worked well in that collaboration that you brought to the table with other artists in the future?
Um, I think working with the Strokes really hammered home the idea of listening to what they want, the bands want, and not second guessing them or trying to tell them that there's a better way to do it or that, you know, m- I had to, I think working with them really showed me to let them do things the way they wanted to do and only step in if there was a problem and be very respectful when ideas were put out. And it was hard because they had so many ideas and there were 5 guys with ideas for long periods of time. So it was very kind of, in a sense, mentally, it took a lot of mental energy just to deal with all the suggestions that were coming in at the same time for long periods of time. I felt like I was channeling 5 different people's ideas all day long, and that was a big responsibility.
Yeah, so what are some of your do you have is there any highlights of that time in the studio with them, like any specific memories that you keep with you?
Well, um, I think definitely on Room on Fire, it was when Julian sat next to me in the chair when sing all of his songs, sat in a chair right next to me, both of us with headphones on, like, having Julian Casablancas sitting in a chair next to you singing an entire album for 2 weeks or something, was really super special. And also, in the book, I mentioned the Albert Hammond Jr.'s solo on "Take It or Leave It." The way it sounded when he played it sounded so perfect and so larger than life at the moment that it was a real wow moment I'll never forget.
And you also worked with Regina Spektor quite a bit too, and you also
On one album, yeah.
on one album. Okay, so that was a pretty big moment for you as well. So when and how did you decide that you absolutely had to work with her?
Well, she played me one song. I never met her before, and she just sat at a piano and played "Poor Little Rich Boy" with the drumstick in one hand and the piano in the other and singing, and, it took about 20 seconds before I realized, "Oh my god, this is the greatest thing," and I love this music. It reminds me of, like, Joni Mitchell and the Moldy Peaches and classical music all rolled into one, and, I just had to get my hands on it. I had to work on that music, just to watch it and be part of it, and, yeah, she's so, so talented.
So when everything with Shoplifter Records happened, were you more worried about losing the label or losing Regina?
Um It was at the same time, it was like, wow, we just released Regina's record, and now my through actions of my partner, Sony was very suspicious of us, and in my view, he kinda stole everything, and, wrecked the chances of the label, and I knew that Regina was gonna be very upset, and I also knew that, like, the satellites had just moved from Mallorca to London to get ready to record with me for the Shoplifter. So they had moved from their home and got a new place in London just for the label to help them, and it fell through, and, it was many add-on negative effects happened when I lost Shoplifter. Even my own record, I had finished my own album with my own band, Black Light, and it was gonna be the first time I could release an album in the world and properly promote it with Sony's money, and it just got to sit in the can where it is to this day, you know?
Would you ever consider starting a label again, or is that kind of
Yes,
an
definitely. I would hope I think I would, because 'cause I'm much more clear-headed now than I was then.
Mhm.
I would need very good people to help me with it. I wouldn't wanna be the one to do the business. I wanna work on the music and produce bands and work on my own music, but I would love to make a label because I every year I run into many cool bands, and if I had the power to help them more, I would love to.
Well, that's awesome. I really hope that that comes into fruition. I would love to see that start up. And that's about all I have for you right now, Gordon. Thank you so
Okay.
much for your time. It's been so awesome talking to you, and best of luck. I know you said you're going to LA here pretty soon, so
Yeah.
best of luck with all of that, and thank you again and again. It was so wonderful to meet you.
Likewise, and thank you.
Okay, bye, Gordon.
Bye.